This video is brought to you by our new show, The Daily Briefing. That's the show where we go through the 5 most important news stories each day, giving you a rundown of everything you need to know around the world in a matter of minutes. Watch on the separate TLDR Daily YouTube channel or listen by searching in your favourite podcast app.
Over the last few years, the US has significantly relaxed its cannabis laws. At time of writing, 37 states and Washington DC have legalized medical cannabis, and 18 of those states, plus Washington DC, have also legalized recreational usage. While this might be cause for celebration for pot advocates, federal law means that cannabis law remains a bit of a grey area in the US. So in this video, we're going to be looking at how cannabis law has evolved over time, both at the state and federal level, and how it might yet change in the next few years. For most of American history, weed was actually completely legal as far as federal government was concerned. This changed with the Marijuana Act of 1937, which required someone to both pay a tax and register to buy, sell, grow, or import cannabis. The registration would then be made available to all law enforcement agencies, including state or local police departments. Since all 48 states at the time had banned cannabis, it was effectively a prohibition. The tax lasted until 1969, when the Supreme Court ruled that it violated the Fifth Amendment because it created a situation where someone would need to self-incriminate. This victory for pot smokers would be short-lived. In 1970, Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act, which created 5 different schedules which would classify a drug and demonstrate how it would be regulated by the federal government. Schedule 5 drugs were deemed to have a very low risk of abuse and acceptable medical usage. These would include things like cough medicine, which you could purchase over the counter. Schedule 1 drugs were deemed to have no acceptable medical use and a very high risk of abuse. These drugs included heroin and are completely banned by the federal government. According to the law, cannabis was placed in Schedule 1 due to its relationship to the use of other drugs, links to aggressive behaviour, and effects on physiology and psychology. Due to the possible health risks and the federal government's strict classification, US states began initiatives to legalise pot. The first of which came in 1996, when California voted for Proposition 215 to legalise medical marijuana. Unfortunately for 420 advocates, it did not deter the federal government from enforcing the Controlled Substances Act. Federal law enforcement agencies soon started conducting raids in California, and the federal government would also start trying to sue marijuana distributors. In 2001, one of these lawmakers would make it to the Supreme Court, where the Oakland Cannabis Buyers Cooperative argued that there was a medical necessity for them to supply medical marijuana to patients. The Supreme Court decision ultimately disagreed, ruling that it was up to the federal government to define if there was a medical necessity for cannabis. Only a few years later, in 2005, the issue was back in the Supreme Court with Gonzalez versus Reich. This time, the focus of the argument for medical marijuana would be the Commerce Clause in the US Constitution, which specifically gives the US Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among several states. Essentially, if something crosses state or national borders, then the US Congress has the power to regulate it. The defendant in this case, Angel Reich, was a caregiver who had homegrown their own medical weed. This was legal under California's Proposition 215, but illegal under the federal government's Controlled Substances Act. The argument was made that Reich's homegrown weed could not be regulated by federal government because it was homegrown and did not cross state borders. Unfortunately for homegrowers of any plant, the Supreme Court had already decided that the federal government was constitutionally allowed to regulate agriculture that didn't cross state lines during the Great Depression because homegrowers were found to have a substantial effect on interstate commerce overall. The precedent was clear, and it would be another loss for legal weed. While the Controlled Substances Act continued to be reaffirmed by the Supreme Court as constitutional, public opinion about legalizing cannabis was steadily changing, and by the early 2010s, polling started to show that a majority of Americans now supported it. By 2019, Pew data put support at about 67%. This shift in public opinion paved the way for Congress to pass the Rohrabacher-Farr Amendment in 2014. Rohrabacher-Farr was an amendment to the law that would prevent the Department of Justice from interfering with state medical marijuana laws. After 18 years, Proposition 215 would finally be protected from federal interference. Around this time, Colorado and Washington became the first two states to legalize recreational weed, and sales were set to begin in 2014. The Obama administration proactively prepared for this by issuing the Cole Memorandum, which directed federal law enforcement agencies to only focus on certain aspects of the marijuana industry. The Cole Memorandum was later rescinded by Trump administration Attorney General Jeff Sessions in 2018, but it could see a comeback. President Biden's Attorney General Merrick Garland signaled that he would consider reinstating the Cole Memorandum in some form during his Senate confirmation hearing. But even if federal agents don't actively interfere, banks don't like working with cannabis dispensaries for fear of violating federal law. Dispensaries often end up having to transport cash around in armoured vehicles or risk being robbed, which adds a lot of risk. Congress may be becoming more 420 friendly though. There are currently several bills before Congress that could be game changers for recreational weed. The SAFE Banking Act, which passed the House with bipartisan support in April 2021, would prevent federal banking regulators from penalising banks who service legal cannabis dispensaries. The House of Representatives also introduced the Marijuana 1-3 Act in January 2021, which would reschedule cannabis from a Schedule 1 drug to a Schedule 3 drug under the Controlled Substances Act. So maybe we are witnessing a real shift in attitude already. If you want to be updated on this story about how the US continues to handle the legalization of cannabis, then be sure to check out the Daily Briefing.
That's our new daily show where we explain 5 news stories every single day. We pick out the big stories, the ones you ought to know about, but we also choose some smaller ones that you might otherwise miss. So if you want to be better informed about the world around you and news from all over the globe, then you really ought to subscribe. And it's only a few minutes each day, so what do you have to lose? We post a video version every weekday over on the TLDR Daily channel, so you can subscribe over there. Or you can listen along to the podcast by searching for the TLDR Daily Briefing in your favourite podcast app. Thanks for your support, and I hope you enjoy the new show.